Today we're doing a huge roundup piece on various game streaming services. This comes back to look at the rotting corpse of Stadia. We'll also be looking at GeForce Now. This is the first time we've really done a look at that. And PS Now, and XCloud, which is the Xbox one, and Amazon Luna. So this is about as in-depth of a roundup as we can fit in the time we're doing for this video. We're going to be covering latency, image quality, and the game settings, and we'll be going over the hardware that's used in the servers, for those of you who prefer the hardware aspect of things. Before that, this video is brought to you by Be Quiet and the Silent Base 802 case. The Silent Base 802 got high accolades in our review for its high build quality and its versatility in both silence-focused and airflow-focused builds. The 802 comes with swappable mesh panels or noise-damped panels, so you have options for either approach. The Silent Base 802 case is able to fit larger builds as well without being overbearing, and it stands out for its mechanics quality and assembly quality. Learn more about Be Quiet's new case at the link in the description below. So this will look at latency, it'll look at the graphics settings, the level of customization you get as a user. We'll be going over some of the basics like billing and how the experience is on that end, but also server hardware and what type of gaming quality you'll get out of the system on the other end of the connection. So this is a big endeavor for us. It will be a long piece, but our goal was to create sort of a one place to go if you're really interested in this stuff and want to know which one's best for you. Hopefully this will give you a great starting point. So we've covered game streaming before, and just to be straight up with everyone up front, it is impossible to do a full review of one service within a piece comparing multiple services. So we are, by nature of this trying to not be an hour long, going to have to make cuts. We're not going to talk about every single thing, but we're going to do our best to cover everyone in sort of the same level of detail. And we have previous in-depth coverage of Stadia, for example, if you want to see more of that. Depending on interest, we may do standalone pieces going forward. But all of these things are sort of in the early stages, and that means it makes a lot of sense to do a roundup. Now, because of the GPU shortage, of course, this topic came up again, and GeForce Now has regularly been suggested as sort of an alternative or a stopgap solution while waiting for hardware to come in. There are a lot of sort of social concerns about game streaming that we're not going to really talk about too much today, but the ones for you to maybe think about are ownership or possession of the things that you use, that you enjoy. Games have long been out of the possession of gamers at this point, exchanging convenience of things like digital stores and security rather than owning a physical copy of the thing. And hardware could go that way too, with things like challenges to right to repair. And then on this end of things, streaming or hardware becoming a service rather than something you own. So that's another topic for another time. We're interested in the technology today and the performance of it. We'll leave that aspect for something else at some point in the future. Surprisingly, there's still only a few major players in the world of cloud gaming. And cloud gaming here, we're talking about services that allow you to stream from a PC or a console across the internet, rather than something like Steam in-home streaming. We're leaving that out for this one. So there are several services other than NVIDIA's GeForce Now and Google's Stadia. For example, Amazon Luna is new-ish. It's in limited early access. There's Xbox Cloud Gaming, formerly called Project XCloud. That only allows streaming Xbox games. There's PS Now, which offers only PlayStation games. And we wanted to check Bethesda's Orion as well, but it's likely to be wrapped into Project XCloud since Microsoft has acquired Bethesda. We're going to do everyone a favor here and do bottom line up front with some of the latency numbers first. So we'll look at a chart comparing everything. There's a lot of nuance and important information to really understand the way those numbers are derived, the hardware they ran on, the game settings they ran on. We're going to cover all of that, but we're going to do you a favor, give you the charts early, and then we'll explain it all. So stick around to make sure you really understand it before you start posting Reddit comments trying to explain the two charts at the beginning. So for methodology, we picked the Surge 2 and Assassin's Creed Valhalla. These wouldn't typically be our benchmarking choices, but it's difficult to find games that share more than 2 of the platforms we're covering today. The Surge 2 comes the closest at 4 out of 5, but it's absent, unfortunately, from Stadia. Valhalla is available on Stadia. It's also available on Luna and GeForce Now, but it's missing from the 2 console services. This complicates benchmarking, so we're just sort of doing the best we can, combining the titles that are on as many of these platforms as possible. Before we get started, a quick note as well that we're based in the continental US. Many of these services have limited availability in other countries, and stream quality depends on having a data center nearby. All of our testing was performed on a very expensive wired fiber internet connection, and that means the recommended speeds for all of these services are met by our service that we receive. Of course, for things that are mobile devices, those are not wired, so those would be over a wireless connection. Latency testing was done using the latency analyzer and a 360 Hz monitor. We covered these in previous content and explained the methodology for those. Check that piece if you'd like to learn more about that. And each service was tested using its own dedicated client to give each the best possible chance. Stadia, Luna, and GFN accept mouse input, so it makes it very easy to use LDAT testing for these and a mouse, while PS Now and XCloud accept only controller input and occasionally touchscreen in the case of XCloud. And this was all accounted for in testing. So here's the bottom line of the latency numbers before we get into the many other important aspects of streaming. That would be things like the quality of service, the game's availability, the billing options, whether they want your card up front or not. We'll talk about that. But in the Surge 2, GeForce Now with the 1080C configuration, we'll explain that more later, and very high settings, ran at 80 to 91 milliseconds, with Luna, the next best, at 113 milliseconds, and then GFN 2060B configuration at 115 to 157 milliseconds. PS Now and XCloud did the worst at 222 to 246 millisecond averages, and beyond 100 milliseconds is where it really starts to become significantly more noticeable as a player. And the PSN and XCloud options are mechanically laggier on end-to-end latency for click to response, which is what we're looking at here. They start to become noticeable in gameplay. In Valhalla, we measured about 147 milliseconds for Stadia, 160 for the GFN 2080D config, and 221 for Luna. Stadia did well here, and we'll talk about all of these numbers in more depth in a bit. And again, as a reminder, these numbers are not as sort of perfect and easy to control as a lot of the other benchmarks we do, because it is based on where these companies have data centers, what type of hardware they're using, which we'll talk about, and there's a lot of factors at play when you start involving the internet and all the hops to get to wherever it's going to and coming from. So numbers can move around a little bit based on where you are, basically. Ours might not represent your numbers if you live in, say, Europe and the data center's next to your house, or in America. Either way, the numbers are going to change for latency, and that's why we're reviewing most other aspects of the services as well today. So we'll start with Stadia. We've covered Stadia a lot in the past. Stadia is still sort of around. It is a nominally free storefront that allows buying the games and streaming them at 1080p. This is done through a Chrome browser on desktop, simply enough. So the Stadia app on Android also works. There's Safari on iOS, allows streaming, or Chromecast Ultra with updated firmware. Those are your options. The list of Android devices that support the Stadia app is growing, but is still limited, while a fully enabled iOS app is unlikely to appear at this point unless Apple changes its App Store policies. Google has also recently announced added support for integrated Chromecasts and Google TVs, some Android tvOS devices, and NVIDIA Shield. The easiest way to use Stadia is to install Chrome on a PC or a laptop. A Stadia controller exists, but it's only necessary when using Stadia on a Chromecast Ultra. Otherwise, its main selling point is direct wireless connection from the controller to a wireless router and then straight to Google server, bypassing the physical connection otherwise. The latency reduction from a direct wireless connection was minimal in our testing. We'll put the chart on the screen, or at least one of them from last time. The reason we say Stadia is nominally free is that as of right now, signing up requires participating in a free trial of the paid Stadia Pro tier. That means entering payment information. This is pretty much a guarantee that Google will collect $10 from everyone that signs up and who forgets to cancel their subscription. Stadia Pro allows streaming in 4K and also offers access to a library of games while the Pro subscription is active. Google has done an excellent job of confusing customers, but given the limited selection of games for sale, it makes sense for it to push a paid subscription model. There's a decent chance for new AAA games to end up on Stadia, but Google doesn't have access to a huge back catalog of games like some companies do, and adding new titles requires additional work from developers to set up a custom Stadia version, especially games with social features. The amount of money that Google can make through directly selling games is limited, though, because there just aren't that many games to buy, whereas subscriptions guarantee monthly payments. Stadia's biggest strength is that it offers 4K HDR streaming, which synergizes well with Google Fiber for those lucky enough to have it. Google's server-side hardware wasn't impressive at launch, though, and it hasn't become better with the passage of time. More demanding games will upscale rather than running at native 4K server-side. That's acceptable for a living room console, but it's really not acceptable for server hardware from a company with effectively infinite money. As far as we're aware, Google is still using AMD graphics hardware without hardware-based ray tracing, and that rules out the use of RT or DLSS or any other modern feature without a total server overhaul. Hopefully, FSR makes its way to some Stadia titles, but even still, Stadia is arguably the best-looking streaming choice for someone who has the money to spend on a 4K display, a fast internet connection, and a $10 per month pro subscription, and somehow hasn't bought a console for themselves yet. One thing Stadia added since last time is tandem controller mode, which is the exhibit meme of controllers. We heard you like controllers, so you can plug your controller into a controller so that you can game while you game. This mode allows a secondary controller to connect to the Stadia controller for a direct connection to its wireless router. It has some accessibility benefits, and in the very least, it shows that people at Stadia are still kind of updating something. Stadia Games and Entertainment, the in-house Stadia game development studio, was recently shut down, speaking of having time to update things, and its in-development projects were canceled, and multiple high-profile team members left, some of them for other cloud gaming projects. It seems unlikely at this point that Stadia will be significantly expanded either in terms of software or hardware before its ultimate death, so for any new users, this is it. It is what it is. It's unclear what will happen to the purchased games in the event of Stadia's closure, but given Stadia's similarities to Luna and Google's list of dead projects, it would be cool if the two services could perhaps somehow cooperate. Since Stadia is the first we're examining, we don't have anything to compare benchmark numbers against yet, but we'll add them as we go through this piece. Our latency numbers are of limited usefulness right now, just keep them in mind as we go. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, the average delay between mouse input and response on the screen was 147 milliseconds. For a much more detailed breakdown of Stadia's latency and the effects of the wireless Stadia controller, you can check out our video from last year. It really hasn't changed much. GeForce Now is up next. So this one is a service from NVIDIA. It's been years in the making. It actually used to be called Grid, and we covered it in 2015, but it only recently got an official launch. This launch, of course, was followed by what you would expect from any successful product launch, and that was a mass exodus of game publishers who apparently suddenly realized that NVIDIA was competing with any streaming services that they themselves might want to launch. The strength of GeForce Now is that it isn't a storefront. Access to any game requires logging into a third-party client. NVIDIA doesn't sell games on GFN, and so it's more familiar to a PC experience. Users browse a list of games, they select the platform, that'd be Epic, Steam, etc., on which the user owns that game, and then they launch the game on NVIDIA's remote hardware. For example, selecting Cyberpunk 2077 offers a choice of logging into GOG Galaxy, Epic Games, or Steam. Because the games are hosted on NVIDIA's server, they're pre-installed and usually pre-updated. In practice, that doesn't mean games launch instantly. Setup for a game like The Division 2 can still take minutes. Of all the streaming services, GFN seems most likely to have any given game thanks to its not a storefront approach. The list of games is a drop in the bucket compared to the full Steam catalog, of course, but it's still a big list. And NVIDIA reliably adds more titles on Thursdays. Game and stream resolution is capped at 1920 by 1200 for GFN, with the highest 16 by 9 resolution being 1920 by 1080. Multiple other resolutions and aspect ratios are supported, but they go down to a minimum of 720p at 16 by 9 or an absolute minimum of 1024 by 768. The resolution cap is likely a network limitation rather than NVIDIA worrying about hardware capabilities. Games launched on GFN actually freely allow you to adjust the settings, even to the point of causing poor performance. Just like when you play a game locally and you can adjust the settings up even if your hardware can't run it. It makes sense that established internet or streaming companies like Amazon and Google have a head start in stream quality. And it also makes sense that NVIDIA has a head start in hardware quality. Allowing users to tweak graphic settings raises an interesting issue. Low stream quality may be enough to cancel out fancy effects that would otherwise be selling points for GFN. If a game is being played through a compressed 1080p stream, then RTX on loses a lot of its impact. Streams are limited to 60 FPS, but because the settings aren't locked, it's possible to disable VSync and run games at much higher frame rates server-side. That doesn't make the stream more fluid. It doesn't scale with the FPS, but it does reduce the latency. The more frequently frames are rendered by the server, the fresher the data is that gets pushed out to the user 60 times per second. There are only a couple of differences with priority and free accounts. RTX is one of them. It's available for paid priority accounts, but disabled for free users via software. And free users are also limited to 1-hour sessions, while paid users have access to an extended session length of 6 hours, with immediate priority access to a new session. Those are the only differences. Free users must queue for a session. We observed queues starting anywhere from 10 to 200, with wait times lasting a few minutes. But this is entirely dependent on the time of day, and sometimes sessions randomly started with the count still in the hundreds. Switching or relaunching games requires re-queuing, and with paid priority access, we never encountered a queue at all. But again, this is dependent on demand at any given time. Using GFN for free also doesn't require entering payment information or signing up for a trial account with your credit card saved, unlike Stadia. So that's a small benefit. GFN is strangely non-homogeneous compared to a lockdown platform like Stadia. The first paid account we created for testing reported an NVIDIA driver version of 461.87, released sometime in February or March, while the free account we created a couple days later reported a driver version of 466.27, released April 29th. We ran a few in-game benchmarks of Shadow of the Tomb Raider with the intention of finding out whether paid accounts get better performance, but instead we found that the free account reported a consistent 105 FPS average at high settings with no ray tracing, while the paid account, under the same conditions, reported an equally consistent 91 FPS average at exactly the same setting. That's a 15% advantage for the free account. It doesn't mean that GFN free accounts all will have better performance or that they're supposed to. It just means that NVIDIA's machines aren't upgraded in lockstep, and performance may vary, perhaps based on server load. Some brief additional testing in Division 2 showed identical performance between the two accounts, although the driver versions remained different. Hardware configurations were reported as identical between all of these test passes as well. NVIDIA also openly uses a mixture of hardware in its servers. Some contain Xeon E5 2697V4 CPUs, which are 18 cores, 36 threads per CPU, or 4 cores and 8 threads per virtual machine, and they also reported Tesla P40s. Others contain Intel CC150 CPUs and Tesla T10 GPUs, divvied up into various sub-configurations among multiple virtual machines. A virtual Tesla T10-8, for example, is part of a physical T10. Control-Alt-F6 during a GFN session launches an overlay that reports the current hardware config, which can be matched up to a community-generated chart. This hardware is assigned at game launch on a priority or availability basis, so your session's resources might not always be matched optimally, it says. The P40 systems are older, pre-RTX, but haven't been fully phased out. We were assigned a P40 at least once during our testing for this piece, and Ampere will presumably make its way onto the GFN servers at some point, adding even more variation. But the important thing to remember is that the hardware is assigned at launch, not based on user-defined settings. So the performance of individual titles is determined by what NVIDIA thinks the title deserves in terms of hardware. Supported platforms for the GFN app are Android, Android TV, macOS, and Windows. There's no iOS app, but like Stadia, GFN is usable within Safari. GFN also works in browser with Chrome, enabling use on Chromebooks. And it's interesting that the development work has been done to get both Amazon Luna and GFN specifically working on Chrome, even though Google has a competing game streaming service that also only works in Chrome. Latency testing on GFN was done with a priority account set to 1920 by 1080 stream quality with 50 megabit per second bitrate cap. That's the maximum allowed. The stream was maxed out at 60 FPS with VSync disabled. Again, these are the stream settings, not the game setting. For the Surge 2, the maximum very high preset with 100% resolution scaling and VSync off were used for settings. We were occasionally assigned the older Tesla P40 1080C configuration with this game, and latency was significantly lower with the older hardware. That's down 31% from 115 milliseconds average on the 2060B configuration to 80 milliseconds average. Quick spot checking of the frame rate, the Surge 2 doesn't have a built-in benchmark and we can't use any software with this setup, showed the 1080C config running at 80 to 90 FPS average and the 2060B configuration running at 50 to 60 FPS average. The 2060B is the lowest tier of configurations that use the T10, so it seems that NVIDIA has judged the Surge 2 to be a relatively undemanding game. We've seen some user reports that the P40 outperforms the T10, and this may be part of the reason. Games that are lightweight enough to get the 1080C P40 configuration will likely only ever get the lowest tier 2060B T10 config. We don't have an easy way to compare, for example, the 1080C performance to the 2080D performance. For Valhalla, we used the maximum ultra-high preset. The 2080D configuration was consistently assigned for this game with a resulting average latency of 160 milliseconds, with peaks at 180. In the same vein as GeForce Now, there are other companies that allow renting a remote system with the focus on gaming. For example, Shadow. Shadow provides an entire persistent system with storage. It doesn't have the insta-launch capabilities of GFN, but it's more flexible, and it can be used for production tasks as well as for gaming. For all intents and purposes, using Shadow is the same as remoting into a desktop PC, and for all we know, it might literally just be that. We haven't tested Shadow, and we don't plan to. The idea of logging into our accounts, especially on a PC in some unrelated company's warehouse, is alarming to us, especially when that company is relatively small and can change ownership easily. We're uncomfortable with the security of it all, while NVIDIA, on the other hand, openly harvests data and uses information the same as everyone else. But we're also confident that NVIDIA has zero use for our Steam password and a vested interest in keeping our accounts secure. Amazon Luna is still in the invite-only early access phase as of this writing. Amazon seems to be attempting a channel-based approach, as in TV channels, with games available through individual add-on packages that cost monthly fees. Currently, only 2 channels are available: Luna Plus at $6 per month and Ubisoft Plus at $15 per month. Subscribing to Ubisoft Plus or other channels doesn't require a Luna Plus subscription. Each channel has its own games, its own pricing and capabilities. For example, the Luna Plus channel allows streaming on 2 devices simultaneously, but Ubisoft Plus only allows 1 device at a time. The majority of Luna Plus titles are lightweight indie games, as opposed to demanding AAA 3D games that users might want to stream because their PCs aren't up to the task. Notable exceptions here would be Resident Evil 7 and Metro Exodus, but neither of these are particularly new releases. It seems likely that Amazon will keep the Luna Plus channel as an inexpensive entry-level demo and reserve the high-demand titles for its partner channels like Ubisoft Plus. Ubisoft Plus gives access to, according to Ubisoft, 100 plus games, as well as some other perks, one of which is titled Cloud Gaming. Ubisoft doesn't have its own cloud gaming platform, and instead, it provides access to select titles through Stadia and Luna, with the choice of platform left up to you. That's sort of cool and ominous. Every company offering a separate monthly subscription for access to their video games is a miserable future if it is going to happen. And yes, we are looking at you, EA. Like Stadia, Luna has its own optional controller for sale that is capable of direct wireless connection. Unlike Stadia, this feature is already enabled and working before the service has fully gone public. The Wi-Fi connection should theoretically reduce latency, although we found the effect to be negligible with Stadia. But the controller can also be used with a USB-C cable or set to connect with normal Bluetooth by default. We do have a Luna controller on hand and have used it, but we'll save these reduced latency claim testing procedures for another day. The Luna controller has an Alexa button rather than Google Assistant button, so you've got 2 flavors of in-home espionage, and its layout rips off the Xbox controller, while Stadia rips off the PlayStation's. It's sort of like the perfect synergy between the 2 of them. Pages for individual games on Luna prominently feature Twitch streams, which could be beneficial for streamers playing games that have a consistent player base, but relatively few viewers. Attention can only flow in that direction, however, if Luna becomes popular, and we have our doubts. Amazon's game division has a notoriously poor track record, and Amazon has an equally poor track record for supporting its game division when it produces something that isn't immediately successful. Moving on to the hardware stuff, Luna's server hardware supports ray tracing, but this feature hasn't yet been enabled in games. Amazon EC2 G4 instances are used for hosting Luna, equipped with NVIDIA T4 Turing GPUs and Intel Cascade Lake CPUs. When we launched Ubisoft Plus titles, which report hardware configurations, they indicated that these were specifically Xeon Platinum 8259CLs, which are 24-core, 48-thread processors that support up to 8-socket configurations. Amazon Web Services is a huge multi-billion-dollar subsidiary of another huge company, so Amazon can certainly afford to throw high-end hardware at Luna if it so chooses. During benchmarking, Valhalla even reported the temperature of the data center's GPU, which climbed to 80°C over the course of a few tests. NVIDIA's T10s reported at lower temperatures when we spot checked, closer to 60°C. Doesn't actually mean anything or imply anything about performance. We were just having fun spying on the company's data centers. Luna is intended to require very little work from developers in order to port the games. But much like Stadia, some Luna games have been modified to lock down graphics options. This is in contrast to GFN and PS Now, which use essentially unmodified versions of games released on existing platforms. Channel holders, however, are able to provide more graphics options. Ubisoft Plus, for example, has PC-style graphics menus in its games. Because Luna lets us adjust the graphics settings sometimes, we can make a head-to-head comparison with GeForce Now in titles which have in-game benchmarks. A quick comparison in Assassin's Creed Valhalla between Luna and GFN puts GFN at 41% ahead of Luna at 60 FPS average versus 43 FPS. This is the best case scenario for GFN as well, because Valhalla is demanding enough to merit NVIDIA's top-of-the-line 2080D server configuration. As a Luna Plus title, the Surge 2 had no graphics options available. Average latency at the settings which Amazon deemed appropriate was 113 milliseconds. Valhalla allowed changing settings, so we picked the same ultra-high preset that we did for GFN testing. Average latency was 221 milliseconds here, which is dismal. PS Now is a service from Sony that allows streaming PlayStation 2, 3, and 4 games, and sometimes downloading them on a PS4 or a PS5. Playing a game on PS Now offers, at best, exactly the same experience as playing the game on a local PS4 or PS3, except streamed. The main advantage of PS Now for PC gamers is that it allows playing PlayStation exclusive games like Bloodborne on a PC. This is not the same as PlayStation Plus. It's a separate subscription with the same pricing, $60 for a year. The symmetrical branding would suggest that Sony expects customers to pick one or the other, but PS Plus is required for online multiplayer, so presumably many PS Now subscribers pay $120 a year in total for both services. Paying for PS Now gives instant access to a rotating library of games. It is an impressively large collection compared to a service like Stadia, but it's nowhere near the full library of PlayStation games, or even all of the games that are available for sale digitally on the PS3. As Sony has chosen not to offer PS2 and PS3 games for sale digitally on newer consoles, or implement backwards compatibility, PS Now is the easiest legal way to play many of those games on a current-gen platform. So we'd like to see the library expand. Microsoft's streaming option, which we'll cover in a moment, only includes a fraction of Xbox titles as well, but its consoles also have some backwards compatibility with physical media, making it less vital to make every game available for streaming. PS Now is also a potential way to circumvent the PS5's limited storage capacity, especially for the digital-only version, but it's not currently possible to stream or download PS5 games or PS5 versions of the games through PS Now. In other words, PS5 owners who get Borderlands 3 through PS Now can only download the PS4 version, even though buying Borderlands 3 would normally come with a free PS5 upgrade. This is very confusing, but hardly any of the games on PS Now are new enough to have PS5 versions at all, so this policy has avoided scrutiny. We found PS Now to be the most difficult service to navigate out of these 5. The desktop app has literally no search function. Every game on PS Now is listed under scrolling categories like horror or what's hot, followed by a scrolling alphabetical category for each letter. Check T for The Elder Scrolls Oblivion, and this is insanity. We can only assume that Sony doesn't actually expect anyone to use PS Now on a PC, because the console application actually does have a search bar. This app is only available on Windows, and the Windows app only works with DualShock 4 PS4 controllers or DualShock 3 controllers, and normal gamepads, so Xbox controllers actually work too. PS Now is not available in a browser, on Macs, or on mobile devices, and it doesn't recognize PS5 controllers. Amusingly, it does work with the Xbox Series X controller, but ultimately games won't launch at all unless a compatible controller is detected. 1080p streaming began to roll out in April of this year. Our testing with PS Now was done with a 1080p 60fps stream because that's all there is. There are no graphics options other than GPU hardware acceleration for the app and for the stream. The stream quality adjustment is handled automatically. Note also that although the stream runs at up to 1080p 60, many of the games don't, since they're running on PS3 and PS4 hardware. Latency for PS Now was one of the worst we've seen so far, at 222 milliseconds average. Overall, we're not impressed. We'd only choose to use PS Now on desktop for older games and PlayStation exclusives that aren't available on PC. Microsoft is up last. The streaming service is currently in beta under the name Xbox Cloud Gaming and is only available through a Game Pass Ultimate subscription. In earlier preview stages, it was known as Project XCloud, which was an objectively cooler and catchier name, so we're gonna keep calling it that. Game Pass Ultimate is Microsoft's catch-all subscription service and includes multiple things, so the $15 per month or $180 per year price for Game Pass Ultimate is not specifically for xCloud, which is essentially a bonus feature. That's in contrast to PS Now, which is $60 a year specifically for that service. Normal Game Pass subs without xCloud are $10 per month. Now, when we wrote this piece, xCloud only worked via an Android app, so there was no convenient way to play on desktop. Microsoft has since brought xCloud to browsers, including Safari, circumventing the Apple App Store actually, and in the future there'll be a Windows 10 app and Microsoft has plans to release its own standalone streaming devices as well. Again, when we wrote this piece, the server hardware for xCloud was racks of Xbox One S's, with a peak streaming resolution of 720p and an Android mobile app as the only way to play. In the final hours of editing this piece though, and actually we've gone back to do an insert for this, xCloud has been upgraded to use Xbox Series X hardware with an accompanying stream resolution upgrade to 1080p, but not 4K yet. If there's enough interest, we can do further xCloud testing with this upgrade, but you'll have to let us know in the comments below. xCloud's use of console hardware means that only console games are streamable, and only at console settings, just like PS Now. Microsoft has won its race with Sony to be the first to offer RT-enabled current-gen console streaming, sort of. But both companies seem reluctant to eat into the game sales by making brand new titles available for streaming. So the small list of RT-enabled Xbox games doesn't really overlap yet with the list of xCloud titles. Control is one of the few games that should have RT on xCloud, but there were no graphics quality options when we launched it. The non-XS version is the one available through Game Pass, and by extension, the one available through xCloud. Of all the services we tested, we found xCloud to be the hardest to actually play games on. Our testing was completed before the Series X upgrade. The latency is large here. It's 246 milliseconds on average, which is absolutely enough to interfere with gameplay. The fact that we had to play on a mobile device, footage here captured on a Pixel 2 and latency tested on a Samsung X Coverfield Pro, connected to Wi-Fi and using a Bluetooth controller, undoubtedly also contributed to latency. In addition, because xCloud streams straight out of a normal Xbox, UI elements aren't scaled for tiny phone screen. So closing it all out then, this is where we would have put those bottom line latency numbers, but we really want to move it to the front. Hopefully that helps everyone understand really the context of what we talked about after that. So let's start with Stadia. Stadia at this point is on life support. It is the only service that offers 4K streaming. When it does die, however, and it will, it may take users' game libraries with it. So for the curious, we'd recommend trying out the free trial of Stadia Pro and paying $10 per month afterwards to rent access to the Pro game library rather than buying individual games, because that may turn out to be a poor investment. And the reason we can say things like Stadia is on life support so confidently and not just be throwing shade for no reason is look at Google's recent history. They've been killing these services slowly but surely, and the writing is on the wall. As for Luna, Luna is the most promising new service, but it looks alarmingly in some ways like Stadia. It's just a couple years later. Luna's worth keeping an eye on, and in its current $6 per month closed beta test state, there's really not a practical reason to use it. Even Ubisoft Plus subscribers could just use Stadia instead, for example. So the cable package style subscription model is depressing here. Maybe it will make the platform more attractive to publishers than Stadia was, but certainly not to consumers. We hope Amazon can figure out a way to combine Luna with Twitch in a cool and unobnoxious way that doesn't have quite the ominous future of this channel subscription pay per game publisher thing that they're doing right now, where everyone's in some weird whatever. It's very hard to understand what exactly it is they're trying to do right now. So Luna's new, and again, worth keeping an eye on. PS Now is by far the oldest streaming service on our list. It dates back to 2013, actually, but it also feels like one of the most half-baked ones. In its current state, it seems like it should be a bonus feature for PS Plus subscribers rather than a standalone, fully priced feature. Its only selling point right now among our audience is the ability to play PlayStation games on a PC. So that's sort of interesting. But Sony also has become increasingly open to releasing its games on PC natively going forward. May not be as much of a lure. Project xCloud is still in early development at this point, but we'll be interested in revisiting it when the desktop application ships. Microsoft did it, took it back, so it should come out again at some point. If Microsoft ever decides to allow streaming PC games through xCloud, that would also become very interesting. Overall, it's an interesting addition to Game Pass Ultimate for current subscribers, but it's not a great reason to subscribe on its own just yet. GeForce Now is, NVIDIA's done a lot of things we didn't like lately. 3080 Ti.
The GeForce RTX 3080 Ti.
3070. GeForce Now is, however, the easiest to loosely recommend here. So if you are going to use a streaming service and it has the games you want, it's the one that we're the most comfortable with, put it that way, I guess. We're not really fully on board with the idea of this total lack of ownership of the entire entertainment chain but that's a different topic for another day. Technologically, GeForce Now is the easiest to recommend, put it that way. So accounts are free. Free accounts offer exactly the same experience as paid accounts in 1 hour chunks, except without ray tracing. And we wouldn't be surprised to see NVIDIA change the subscription model in the future. But for now, there's not a ton of reason not to make an account and just try it out, except for wasting time potentially. And that's not as big of a deal as some of the other things where you're investing money, wasting time and money. We also like the fact that you don't have to put in payment information for that free account, unlike Stadia, where you put it in, they hope you forget that you put it in and forget to cancel until that first charge is issued. So GFN is also situationally more powerful than the other streaming services, but it really depends on what hardware it signs you, and that depends on what game you're playing to some extent. Also the load of the hardware. Either way, GFN consistently behaves more like a PC gaming experience in that it will allow you to change the graphics settings and menus. It's generally more open than the other services, so that makes it interesting as well. So that's our roundup of the streaming services. Like we said, there's an infinite amount to talk about here, and we got to cap it somewhere. This is going to be it. Hopefully that helps give you a baseline, and let us know which one you're the most interested in if you want us to look at more of them or in more depth. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more as always. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a shirt like this one, or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus. We'll see you all next time.